Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Big Idea Podcast. My name is Eric Bramlett. I am joined by Tammy Melchien. Tammy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Great. We're going to have a good time sharing a little bit about what's happening with the Big Idea for Easter Sunday. Easter at Community 2016. It is a standalone weekend. As we speak about this, the teaching process is already well underway with a first draft showing up tomorrow.
Yes.
So this will be a little bit different in terms of where we're headed, because we actually kind of have a little bit more detail about where the message is headed, and that may be a little bit more specific than even the Big Idea map communicates. But we're starting with the map. We're starting with where we're headed for the Big Idea for Easter Sunday. And kind of the theme within the theme of Easter at Community is eyewitnesses. So talk to us just a little bit, Tammy, about kind of this overarching, I guess it's a metaphor. It's not really a metaphor, but just like this idea of, this eyewitness account at Easter.
Well, we want to tell the story through the eyes of the people who actually witnessed it, who actually were there. And the throughout the message, the three groups we're going to focus on are the disciples themselves, the women who stuck by Jesus even at the cross, and the religious leaders who were trying to do everything they could to keep this from really happening.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Whatever they thought was going to happen, they wanted to make sure it didn't.
Yeah. And so we're going to look at the story through their eyes and the eyewitness testimony that we have for this. Our overall hope, I think, for this message is that if you are a Christ follower, if you are someone who believes in the resurrection, that you're going to leave this feeling there is like such good, strong, historical, concrete reasons why I believe. And so that your faith will be encouraged, that you will be strengthened in your resolve. And hopefully because of that, then your perspective on life will be realigned to what's really important, what really matters. The second group of people are maybe people who don't believe, or who's skeptic, or who just don't do this. Our hope is that they walk away from this going, okay, maybe I need to give this another look.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to examine this a little more closely.
So would you say that this, for that group of people, is this day gearing up for like a cross the line of faith kind of thing? Does it get that far in terms of like make a decision for Jesus if you're skeptical? Like how far does it go?
I think I don't know if we had built an actual finding your way back to God thing in the
I don't
in
remember.
the message. I can't remember, but we certainly could look at that through the process. I think where the message is going to land is more like, if the resurrection really did happen, which throughout the message, hopefully we will be building your confidence that
Right.
it did, it changes everything.
Yeah.
And
So you have to have some kind of come to Jesus moment.
yes, yeah,
If what we have said or what we've laid out is true.
yes, yeah,
And challenging people towards that.
yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Good. Well, and it is Easter Sunday, so it is that sort of. This is the soapbox of every year, but it is the time where more people than ever make plans to be there. Some of your people are the once a monthers that show up on Easter. Some your regulars are there. Your once every 6 monthers. Your Christmas and Easter onlyers. And as well as just a truckload of brand new people. People who have not set foot into your environment until this moment. So we're definitely praying for that and praying for those people that they will be inspired, and we'll kind of reveal this as we go too. But we are really also trying to align this day with the series that follows it, and really trying to create kind of a handoff that says, you don't want to miss next week as we start a brand new series. So. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But let's start with just kind of where this begins, this idea of eyewitness, this idea of, something in the past, historical stuff. And we kind of have this fun intro that we're looking at. Basically taking a look at three events in our history that are true. We believe them to be true, but there are some parts of it that have kind of become fable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like always in every historical event there is truth and there is something that grows up as a legend or a fable around it.
Right.
And
Like Paul Revere,
yes,
he definitely rode and said the British are coming.
he warned the British were coming, but because of the poem, we all think that he was the one that went all the way to Concord, and that's kind of how it
Right.
goes. But he actually got captured by the British in Lexington, and some other dude had to go. So there's part of that that's true, and there's part of it that's fable.
We don't really sing the other dude's name,
No.
or he's not a part of a poem,
No.
so we just kind of leave him. I'm sure it'll be an Oscar-nominated film next year. The story of the real Paul Revere. Titanic.
Titanic, one of the
It
things
did really happen.
It did really happen, but the funny thing about that is, a lot of people think it's fable, and I know you might think that is what do you mean? But was it last year that was the 100-year?
Yeah, there was an anniversary about the sinking of
Recently,
the Titanic
yeah.
recently in a post-Twitter world, and there was enough legitimate Twitter fodder of millennial types who just only knew the Titanic from the Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate
Movie,
Winslet movie.
Didn't realize it had really happened.
Didn't realize it was based on a true story. Yeah.
So they saw it as fable, but it was actually true.
Although there's a good chunk of that video or that film that is not true. That
no
has
Rose,
there's
no
no
Jack.
Rose, there's no medallion.
Still think he could have gotten on that door.
I think he absolutely could have been saved if he was not fictional.
Anyway.
And then the third is the Cold War, and this is a real fun video clip that we want to be able to incorporate into the message. Someone has actually taken clips from Rocky IV and fashioned them into a ESPN 30 for 30 style documentary, and basically makes the claim that Rocky Balboa ended the Cold War because of what happened in Rocky IV against the Russian who must break you. And it's a nice little rule of three to be able to kind of hit this idea. There's stuff that's happened in our past that we recognize as history, but how much of it is fable? How much do we really believe actually happened? Which hopefully segues us into the storyline.
Yeah, I think, and where it can lead us to is, for the majority of historic events, we have very little evidence, but yet we feel confident in the history that we have. For example, one example is Alexander the Great. If you remember that back from your high school world history classes, there's stuff that we talk about. We have in our history books about Alexander the Great, but really everything we know about him comes from one source that was written hundreds of years after he died, but yet we don't really question it.
Right.
And so much of our history is like that. And when you compare what we have with the Bible and with the historical accounts in the Gospels, and I mean, when you compare the amount of historical evidence, I mean, we have more evidence for the reality of the resurrection than we do
many other things that we take as history.
Yeah.
Interesting. So let's take a look then at these three groups of people and what are, because I think that what rises to the top for each group is a particular vantage point or a reaction that they have to the resurrection. Do we start with the women? Is that?
I think we're going to start with the disciples. Probably.
Okay,
yeah.
so let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, what we find in the disciples in their eyewitness account, thinking about Peter, John, all of them, is basically these guys all bail on Jesus before the crucifixion. I mean, they run, they deny him, and they're hiding in an upper room. So really, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this story from the perspective of Saturday. The crucifixion has happened, but the resurrection has not yet happened. Yeah. And what we find with the disciples is we find a bunch of guys who are afraid. Yeah. And we find a bunch of cowards. and so, that's where we find them on Saturday. With the women, I mean, at least they had the courage to stick with Jesus to the cross, and we're told that they were there crying at the foot of the cross. But where we find the women on Saturday, these eyewitnesses, is they're despondent. I mean, they're just heartbroken, and they're getting ready to prepare the spices to go anoint his body. But you just despondent women. So you have scared disciples, you have despondent women. What we find in the religious leaders is they're nervous. And it's interesting. It's almost like the religious leaders believed more in Jesus because they're the ones that are taking precautions. They're sealing the tomb. They're placing guards and all of that because they're nervous about what is happening. But what we don't have on that Saturday is we don't have anyone expecting a resurrection. And honestly, that's exactly probably what we'd expect to find. I mean,
Right.
no one was expecting the resurrection.
Even though Jesus said it over and over and over again
Yeah.
while he was there
How many
with
times
them.
does he say stuff to us?
To us, yeah. No, I know. Yeah, no, it's like when I talk to my kids, I'm like, I told you to do that, and I hear myself and I hear God saying, I told you to do that. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't do it.
Yeah. So the way Andy Stanley says it is on that Saturday, nobody was expecting no body.
that's a pun burn right there. Yeah,
but
good.
that's kind of where where you look at it. And so then if you fast forward a day or two after the resurrection, all of a sudden you've got these bold disciples, preaching out openly in public. You've got women who are rejoicing, and also women who are the first witnesses to that, which culturally would not have really
Well, yeah, not only
been the way the story would go.
Yeah, even if that's how it really happened, that's not how they would have documented it,
No.
because that would have ensured that people would not have believed it.
No.
It's like for them to be bold enough to say, yeah, this is how it happened,
Yeah.
was a big step too.
And in all the years that followed, there is no evidence that any single one of the disciples recanted. And we have to believe that if even one of them had recanted, those religious leaders would have jumped on that. We would have that recorded in history,
Right.
but it is nowhere. And so when you really step back and you look at this evidence, the only explanation is that the resurrection really happened. And that's the
Did we
the
hit
heart
on
of this
the
message.
the religious leaders, their nervousness?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right.
Are you awake now? Or?
I zoned out. Well, no, I did. But I mean, I think
Yeah.
want to make sure we got it. So I think that hopefully that path then gets us to the point where we can then fast forward and say, okay, what does this mean for us?
It happened. So then, why does it matter that it happened?
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're looking at, and this is where we have an opportunity, if it works, kind of exactly right, and it may not be, absolutely perfect, but we have an opportunity then to maybe share some stories, either through video or just through narrative within the text that reflect some of those things. People in our environments at community who were afraid, or who were despondent, or who were nervous about the implications of a relationship with Jesus, or that it could be true that he is alive and wants to have a relationship with us right now. We think that if we search out those stories in a diligent way and in a specific way, that those stories could be kind of a sneak preview of the series that follows. The series that follows is a series called #MyStory, and we're just going to dive right into talking about it because it is the series that follows Easter. And so there are 4 weeks of my story, #MyStory, and really the idea is that we're looking for transformation. We're seeing that there are some real problems, some real tragedies, some real ways in which our fallen world has kind of beaten us down, that God wants to redeem, that God wants to take and really kind of transform and create a brand new story with our life. So, we don't have the specific details of who those, might be, but my encouragement to you as you're experiencing this is to begin a process of, investigating within your location and within your circles.
Because it's always even more powerful when the video comes from your campus.
Absolutely.
So fight over getting them.
Yeah, exactly. We want to have more than enough options. We want to have to make tough decisions, and with these 4 weeks,
You're more screwed up than you are.
Right, exactly. Man, your story is whack. Cannot wait to tell that story. But yeah, that is the segue. So now we're in the first week of April, and we're past Easter Sunday, and we're looking at a brand new series called #MyStory. So what is the big idea, Tammy?
Well, some overview a little bit of this too, and this series came out of probably the biggest thing we heard in the annual brainstorm was this Felt Need series about needing to address things like addiction and shame and stuff like that. And pairing that along with last year when we did the Finding Your Way Back to God series, how those personal stories were so powerful. We thought this would be a great thing to follow up Easter with, looking at that, a real felt need series. And so this series, the series verse there is from 2 Corinthians 5. Anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone and a new life has begun. And so this whole series is about, my old life was this, whether that's something in the past or whether that's something current. Your old life can be this, but my new life can be this. And so in every week of the series, we're going to look at maybe a struggle, a challenge, whether that's fear, whether that's addiction, whatever it might be, and that, to know that was the story of my old life, but my new life can be a story of freedom, can be a story of faith, whatever it might be. And so it's going to be this old life is gone and the new life has come.
All right, well, let's get right into it then. So each week we're kind of focusing on a different aspect, a different way in which kind of we're moving from an old life to a new life. So week 1, where are we at? Okay,
so week 1 is about fear, that my old life was filled with fear. And in this week we're going to use a narrative that I don't know that we've used very often, of Elijah in the Old Testament, where
yeah, I love the story.
he is coming off of this spiritual high where he's defeated the prophets of Baal, and he's had victory after victory. He's prayed, and rain has come down in a time of drought, and then you flip the page to the next chapter, and it says the queen makes a threat against his life, and he runs away like a scaredy cat.
Yeah.
All of a sudden he's just full of fear, and so we find him hiding under a tree, and then we find him in a cave. And I love in this passage in 1 Kings, 2 times God comes to him and says, "What are you doing here?" And just that image of, being hiding in a cave full of fear and God going, "What are you doing here?" And for us to look and say, and there may even be ways that people don't recognize at the beginning of this message that they are living in fear. But, we want to use that cave a little bit. And I don't know if these 3 will be the ones that we land on when we brainstorm in the teaching team. But, sometimes we can end up in a cave of bitterness, that God, I did everything you said and things still didn't work out the way that I wanted to. And so we're hiding in that cave and we're afraid to continue on with him. Sometimes that can be a cave of despair, just like this is too hard, and I'm just going to stay here. Sometimes I think it's a cave of comfort, thinking we already did enough that I like things the way they are. And
the punch card is full. I'm done.
Yeah, and so that holds us back. And so, the challenge in this message, I think, is to look and say, are there places where fear is dominating my story and keeping me from living the new story that God has for me? And to hear God saying to you, what are you doing here? Come out of the cave. Yeah. And so that'll be the focus of week 1.
That's good. I love it. All right, week 2. This is a topic that, I think we probably haven't addressed as specifically as this in devoting an entire week to it, but we've certainly felt the effects of it in this community, and that's the challenge of addiction, and the way in which addiction kind of just tears apart, and keeps us from living out that new story.
Yeah. And it's going to be a challenge to do this in 1 week, because you have so many different angles you could take on this. But again, so we're looking at, okay, if my old story was a story of addiction, what God wants to write is a new story of freedom. And the challenge scripturally a little bit in this one is we don't have, Timothy was, hooked on prescription drill or drugs, and
right.
And we don't have a clear narrative of that. But we do have Paul saying some things that are interesting when he describes the thorn in his flesh, that we don't know what that is. We have no idea. And he says, I begged for God to take it away from me. And God just keeps saying, my grace is sufficient for you. We have him, talking about that passage of what I want to do, I don't do, what I don't want to do. I mean, certainly the language that he's using there could be could sound, if you applied that to someone that was struggling with an addiction, it's very relevant.
Yes.
And so we're not gonna make Paul into having
a
a
drug addict.
addict, but yet, you know, he was obviously struggling with something that
Any more than Jack and Rose are on the Titanic.
there you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's good.
But really the key passage in this is the Romans 6:1, and particularly the last verse there. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you're not under the law but under grace. And that idea of sin being your master is really going to be the focus of this message. Because, you know, no one ever says, you know, hey, I want to be mastered by this thing.
Right. Here's my plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No one intentionally messes up their life and ends up, you know, in bondage to something. So the question, you know, the heart of the question here is there something that's mastered you? What has mastered you? And we're doing a little research in that just to see. Craig Rochelle is someone who openly talks about that he's an alcoholic, that when he was younger. And so he's done several messages on this topic, and we have Docent doing some research also to see. Again, we want to be careful not to be too like trite,
Right.
and simplistic in this.
Yeah.
But yet we also want to, you know, make sure we leave people with some practical handles
Yeah.
to start taking a next step.
Yeah,
so,
and I do think, I mean, if you look at, you know, the church culture and why it hasn't been talked about or why it falls short, I think a lot of times people try to solve it, you know, in a way that, you know, I mean, if you look at what Paul says, he's been changed. He has had his redemption story, and yet he says, you know, I want this removed, whatever it is. I don't want to do these things, and I do them. You know, it's the 12-step routine where, you know, like you just said in the present tense, you know, an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic, which is to say that even though I haven't had a drink in 12 years or whatever, that, you know, that part of
is my old story. Still,
yeah, is my old story. And I think a lot of times we would look at a thing like this and like, let's just have an altar call. Let's just, you know, pray it away and make sure that, you know. And so it is tricky to be able to offer next step practical solutions.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean,
I think
you know,
what is on the map here that Rochelle does, you know, might end up being something we use that, you know, his first thing is can the excuses, which is basically just get honest, get real, stop denying it. He actually, in one of the talks, has, here's 6 questions. If you answer yes to 2 or 3 of these, then you have a problem. And when he reads the 6 questions, I mean, it's, you know, a family member has said I have a problem. Like, you know,
right,
type
right,
of thing.
yeah.
So we may use something like that too. But can the excuses, the second thing he says, cut the ties. If there's someone or something that's leading you to this, that you need to cut it. You need to cut the tie. And the third thing is fill the void. And so I feel like we could potentially give people, you know, starting points.
Yeah.
But we may need to think about, and this may even be some resource we have or want to put together of, you know, if here's you know, the information for AA groups in your area. Here's
right. Yeah.
you know, whatever that
And
might be.
some of our campuses have, you know, Celebrate the Journey,
Yeah.
you know, small groups or, you know, just some specific support and recovery small group entities that could be made available for that particular weekend. I think that could be a really good resource.
Yeah.
You know, and really fostering the idea that, you know, part of the problem here is you're trying to do this alone.
Yeah.
You know, and
And you can't.
and you can't. So yeah, no, that's good. All right, let's talk a little bit about my favorite one, which is shame. I mean, if I had to pick a favorite,
That's one you like having
that's the one.
best?
I'm down with shame.
Is that
Let's
just
do
because
it.
you like doing the thing that then
Right?
brings
Yeah,
us to-
it's
okay,
like
I
this.
got you.
Yeah. I mean, some people call that an addiction, but you know, if I'm addicted to shame, then so be it.
Okay.
All right, what are we
I'll
talking
say.
about?
So we're talking about my old story's full of shame, but my new story, I'm going to see how God redeems that. And we're going to use Moses for this one. And you think about Moses, he was, you know, he was an Israelite, but he was raised in the palace of Pharaoh. And we're still doing some research on this, but you have this image here of, you know, almost like imagining him in the palace of Pharaoh with a scepter. And then he goes and he does this horrible thing. He kills a man. And the scene changes, and now instead of standing in the palace with a scepter, he's in a wilderness field with a staff, with a shepherd's staff, and he's watching sheep. And you got to think that there was something in him that would go, how did I end up here? Like, look at what I did. Like, how did my life go this way? And the shame that could have been on him for that. But what we're trying to do some research on is this idea of a staff, because it's interesting when you think about that staff then, that in some ways I think represents his shame, but how it becomes something that God powerfully uses. Because if you move through the story then of the Exodus, it's the staff that he throws down and it becomes a snake to prove to Pharaoh and the people that he had authority of God. It's the staff that he uses to strike the rock so water comes out. It's the staff that he uses to put in as long as the staff was in the water, the Red Sea divides. When he held the staff above his head, the Israelites would win the battle if he put it. So the staff, this thing that was a symbol, could have been a symbol of his shame, becomes something that God uses, like, powerfully.
Yeah, no, and we don't talk about it often in the context of Moses, but we talk about it a lot in the context of, the Christmas story, where we talk about the shepherd and the status of a shepherd, and where they are in society, and I mean, certainly that must have also been true for Moses, or at least at the beginnings of that.
And the type of thing, I think, obviously we'll be looking for stories, is this one reminds me of a story, so this may help some thoughts, is when I was working in campus ministry, I had a college student, she's probably 20, 21 years old at the time, come to me, and I was the first person, other than I think her mom knew, but I was the first person that she ever told in her life. Even her father didn't know that she had an abortion. And, obviously, and it had been several years, but it was like it happened yesterday in her emotionally. Yeah. And, what ended up happening is I got her connected with a woman who led like recovery groups for that type of thing, and there were very concrete, specific things we do. And now you fast forward, it's probably 12, this started happening way sooner, but it's like 14, 15 years later now, and she is actually like leading a ministry that reaches out to women that have made that choice and have had that experience. And I look at a story like that of something that was her greatest, shame for her, that had consumed her for years, to not even tell your father or your sister or, but has now become something that God powerfully works. And whenever I have, like over the last 15 years, whenever I have someone come to me to talk about that life experience, I always reach out to her and I'm like, hey, do you mind if I give this person your email? And she's always, absolutely,
Yeah. No, that's a real clear, concrete example of that specific transaction from shame to redemption, where you have that, and I think that also may help distinguish this from, some of maybe the other weeks where it's like, I might think about addiction and not, So sometimes the solution part of this can get a little muddy. So I think as we're thinking in terms of these stories that we're gaining, it's going to be important to be able to, identify those particulars that might identify a particular story for this week as opposed to a previous week or the week after. All right, well, we're wrapping it up then with week 4. Not my favorite, and that's failure. Yeah, we won't have it. We won't have it.
Yeah, but this one's easy.
I forgot.
I think very
of the
successful
4,
at failing.
This one is easy. Got it.
All right.
Week
so
4.
So
failure.
week 4, we're talking about moving from failure to promise, and the idea of a failure being in my life, but realizing that my new life can be a life filled with promise. And the concept that we're going to go with here, which I've never heard anyone really talk about it this way before, I think I came across a blog post that sparked this idea for me, is when you look at Peter and Judas, they had the same failure. Like they basically did. Both of them like betrayed Jesus. And yet their story, the paths of their stories take 2 completely opposite paths. And one of the questions that made me think of it, this is a question I'd never thought of before, is imagine if Judas, rather than being overwhelmed and overcome by his failure, and if you're not familiar with the story, he actually takes his own life.
What?
I know. But imagine...
Spoilers. You're supposed to say spoilers.
Imagine if Judas had actually come back to Jesus, with his failure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is no doubt in my mind that would be the greatest story in history. I mean, imagine like having that in the New Testament of your Bible. I mean, and imagine what God would have done through his life.
Yeah, there's a really powerful play that was written recently by someone who's not a Christian, and basically it's the trial of Judas Iscariot, and it imagines the exact scene that you're describing, and it is.
So someone has thought about it before.
Well, I don't think they've thought about it in this way in terms of like Peter and Judas on the same path, but there are stories out there imagining, what does it look like for Judas to be connected to Jesus again after what he did. And
because you see Peter, return to Jesus, and we won't go into a lot of detail of the, do you love me, like, story.
Right.
But yet, so they start from the same failure in essence, and one becomes the leader of the first church, leads thousands of people back to God, whose life leaves a lasting legacy, and the other one 2 days later is dead.
Right, and lots of people name their kids Peter.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot of Judases out there. What's your son's name? Judas.
So, hopefully people come from this realize that the problem is not the failure.
Yeah.
The issue is whether or not you will bring that failure back to Jesus.
Yeah, forgetting what is behind.
Yeah.
And moving forward. Yeah, I think you've got that verse in there from Philippians, and that's like the classic, like the success. It's like press on towards the goal, press on towards the goal, press on towards the goal. But you forget that starts with needing to successfully forget what is behind. And I think a lot of people get tripped up on that because they haven't been able to do that. All right, well, I think our ability to be able to riff on this and think about personal stories that hit us really does speak to the fact that, this is like kind of wrapped in a bow, the quintessential felt need series. There's great stuff both from the Old and the New Testament. Be thinking and be praying about, okay, what are the stories that are out there that we need to, prayerfully consider as a part of, putting together this, this story. And I think, the more specific, the better. It's this weird thing that happens when we're able to take a story and create specifics around it and share those specifics. This is the specific thing that actually happened to me. It has this universal effect where it really does, like, it allows you to step into that story and to be able to say, yeah, I relate to that part of it. I know exactly what that person's feeling. And that it changes lives. It really does.
Yeah.
All right. So that's what we got. #MyStory. Lots of opportunities there for some fun brainstorms and some really powerful stuff. So hope you have success with your brainstorms, be it for large group or small group content. And I think that's all I have to say. You got anything else?
I'm good.
All right. Thanks, Tammy.
Guys.
And we'll see you next time.